June 4th, we are here again to talk about the mental obsession, the central cause of addiction, and have an open discussion about it. Really, mental health is the essence. Mental illness and insanity is the root of addiction. The idea that somehow I can do more of something and get better when the thing I'm doing more of is killing me is basically the sort of nuts and bolts of what compulsions are about. Somehow I can hide my inner motives by being completely obsessed with or compulsed or consumed by doing something on the exterior constantly, and think that somehow by avoiding it and by ignoring what I'm actually doing to cause it, that I'm going to get better as a result of it. So that's what we talk about. Our focus is on principles. Our focus is on an absolute nature. Our focus is on beginning to notice that if there is an essence, as described, first of all, in the big book, but throughout history, if there is an essence of that sort, then that essence is essential. It isn't an option. It isn't a choice. It isn't a negotiation. It's an absolute state of being that we already know, that we're fully aware of, and that by preoccupying ourselves in thinking, we make believe we're not aware of, that it isn't there because we don't feel like it's there. If an infinite source is only there when I feel like it's there, then my feelings would be more powerful than that infinite source because I would be able to chase it away or have it come and go. And that's a very rational, thought-based concept, something humans do. It's not something an absolute state of loving nature does. That nature can't come and go. It can't be more or less than it is. It can't be here and not there. It can't be mine and not yours. It's something we all absolutely share without division, without separation, without distinguishment, nothing. It's absolute and it's ever present and always available, always in reach, always the essence of our knowing, and not always necessarily the essence of our thinking, especially when we're thinking about our thinking and making believe that who we are is what we think and get off into that tangent of insanity of making believe that we become the creators of reality simply because we can think about our thinking. So when we think we're talking to ourselves, we're really not talking to ourselves, we're talking to our thoughts. And when we think we're thinking to ourselves, we're not thinking to ourselves, we're thinking to our thoughts. And just because thinking can think of itself does not mean the self it creates is who I or you are. And the basis of sobriety talks about self-centeredness being at the core of the problem because that self we think is centered there is literally a delusion, an idea, a narrative, an illusion we've taken so seriously as to make believe it's who we are. And if who we are, we think we made up, we become the creators of reality and all of a sudden are actually opposed to reality and truth and filled with fear because we know better than to make believe there's any win in a fight against everything and everyone. It's impossible. So we live with dread. Jose mentioned guilt. That feeling of guilt is an accurate assessment of what we're doing that we're guilty for. Same with shame. When we're ashamed for what we're doing, we feel shame. We know better than to make believe we can get this thing right if we keep perpetuating these ideas about who I think I am and who I think everyone else is, rather than start to realize that I am, as you are, and we are as we are synonymously.
Question, Jack. You mentioned feeling things like guilt and shame, but doesn't the active addict kind of engage some kind of psychopathic or sociopathic feeling, at least when they're under the influence? And doesn't the guilt and shame kind of just rush to you when you're not high or drunk?
Well, I think when your preoccupation is with an outside substance, you're basically thinking that everything you need is that outside substance. So you're distracting yourself from the inside lack of substance in your thinking. If the thinking I'm doing that's creating the misery is one that has me only as I think, and that's not who I am, then I have a thought that has no basis, no substance, no reality to it. It's literally an illusion that I'm maintaining as reality and truth, which is technically defined as a delusion, and wondering why I feel guilty and ashamed. And the only reason I wonder is because I want to twist everything backward to make it look like I'm not doing what I'm doing so I can continue to justify continuing to do it over and over again. And there again is addiction, but now we're talking about it in relation to thinking. Since reality is reality and the basis of existence is reality and truth, and love and light and life and all of those things, life isn't defined by the life forms we occupy. The life forms we occupy are defined by life and light and love and that absolute nature. And to think that's not true is to make believe we can create our own truth and our own experience, and the self we think we are then becomes the dominant force, and that's insanity. And it creates the depression and the conflicts, the anxiety disorders that give us the impression that we need to do something to feel better, like drink or use drugs or gamble or whatever can release adrenaline and whatever the other chemicals are in our body, the serotonin, dopamine, whatever those things are that we can release to actually turn on our own chemical factory to feel better while we're actually doing something that's worse. And that is an addiction.
It was funny because last night I was hanging out with an actress and she was telling me how she just goes on like casual coke benders when she's bored. And I was like, fishing around. Sometimes I do that with people who do drugs. I want to see where they're at. And the concept of prostituting herself for her addiction struck her as just profoundly, like, that will never happen, profoundly foreign. But for me, that makes total sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I know so many people that have done that in addiction, and I don't just mean prostituting yourself sexually, but in many different ways.
Well, consider, Jimmy, if we think who we are isn't who we are, we're prostituting all of our thinking and all of our will and all of our faith and all of our trust and all of our hope and all of our belief by making believe an imposter, a fraud, is who we are. Something that has no basis becomes who we are. That is a suicidal thought because we're literally arguing in favor of non-existence as being our existence.
It becomes performance theater. And in Rome, of course, prostitution and acting were synonymous.
So if we're acting out, we're free to do that. We can always act out. We can always choose an illusion to be who we think we are. And as long as we think that illusion is an illusion and we're choosing it, there's no conflict in that. There's nothing wrong with that. It's when we think it's right and real, do we take ourselves so seriously as to think our life depends on maintaining those thoughts.
That is why I think the big book refers to us in those theatrical terms as the actor.
Yes. But actors are anyone who takes action. So if we have a capacity to begin to have the basis of our thinking straightened out, as the book says, we can straighten out physically and mentally. If we begin to straighten out based on the fact that we've surrendered one thing, alcohol or drugs, whatever it is, to a power greater than ourselves, we begin to align with reality rather than this misconception and insanity of making believe that what we think is in fact reality and truth. And that is the ultimate central issue, the central mental issue. The mental obsession is central to every compulsion and reactive and impulsive behavior, all of them. It isn't to say we can't react, but I would say the difference between responding, being response-able, meaning we can respond, we're considering things and responding considerately rather than reacting automatically as a defensive posture. And if you think of reaction, it's something we've done over and over and over again, hoping someday it'll be better and it'll work. And to Jose's written point, he just put a chat in that says we're spiritual beings having a human experience. So that's a very common thought, but coming to terms with that, I mean, literally coming to terms with that is starting to see that we have been addicted to thinking that is not true, making believe it defines us. And that if we don't have agreement and people challenge that thinking, our life is threatened and our whole world is destroyed because we're not living in a world where everybody agrees with what we think.
Jack, question.
tends to be the source of our conflicts.
The whole idea of we're spiritual beings having a human experience, doesn't that only relate to like less than 1% of human history? Because humans were like food for saber-toothed tigers and stuff in the jungle. And it was only like a short while ago we started building civilizations. And then after we stopped being food for other animals, I feel like that's when we start having all these thoughts and collective awakenings and spiritual awakenings. But for like 99% of human history, we were just fucking like living in caves and shit and trying not to get eaten. So what's so spiritual about that?
Well, spirit is a word. Spirituality is a word. I mean, I think JP could address some of this too, because that's something he looks at pretty seriously. The fact that monotheism, he has come to learn, is a devolution of this spiritual concept. But if there is, spirituality is basically just unseen. You know, it's this component that seems to be ethereal, seems to be beyond touch, beyond tactile sensation. So it's not something we can smell or see or hear, or it's just a presence. And that tends to define it. If that's the essence, then the essence of the universe has always been that essence. And I would say the universe would be small when you're thinking of something infinite. It would just be a universe that's limited. Because if the universe is growing wherever it is right now, it's limited relative to the distance. If it can grow, it must be going somewhere it's never gone. So it must be limited presently to be able to go in that direction. And even today, the physicists see that at some point, it seems like it's going to come back and contract. So it's going to undo what it's been doing. But regardless of that, and not trying to pick a fight with physicists or make any kind of comments that can seem inflammatory, but simply look at the fact that if the essence of life is the essence of life, and it seems to be a substructure that's invisible, then it included all of the atoms and air and oxygen and all of the things that were components of that time you were talking about, Jimmy, that allowed the mountains to be mountains to even have caves, and allowed the creatures to be able to eat us and us learn how to protect ourselves against them. I would suggest what you're saying is there probably wasn't a lot of neurosis going on and a lot of anxiety disorders when people were just fixated on survival and being safe and trying to figure out how to do things like light a fire. That was a revolution in human history, being able to warm things up, cook food. JP is saying no, and I'm sure that there's a potential contention for everything that we can think. But it seemed to me fire was a fairly significant point at which, once humans understood that they could actually create it, it gave them a chance to utilize it in ways that warmed them and cooked food and prevented bacteria and other things from potentially harming them.
Then the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs that let us evolve is also very spiritual and perfect.
Yeah. Well, it did what it did without any exception. And the matter it was made of clearly came out of it. The matter it was made of wasn't there in the beginning of the universe. It was made as a process of this universe. The iron or whatever I think most meteorites and comets are made out of iron largely. I don't know. I haven't met many of them. I've got some of them here on my desk, and they seem to be pretty magnetic. But yes, that formation, we have life forms. That's what we're living. We have life forms, meaning forms of life. What does that mean? Our experience is a possibility of what life is capable of producing. And if there's an infinite abundant source, it means all possibilities are possible. But interestingly, it also allows for the freedom for us to think what's impossible is possible and live in a constant state of demoralization trying to do that, trying to perfect that idea. And today's announcement, given that this is the 6th month and willingness is the 6th step principle, think of the willingness that each of us exhibited in the drinking and the using and the obsessive thoughts to continue to do those things well after there was ample proof that it wasn't working. So we can take principles and use them in the exact wrong direction. And I would suggest that most principles are only ever applied over and over and over again when we're trying to do something we can't do. Because if I'm willing to do something I can do, I immediately do that thing, and I am confirmed by the potential of it being realized, because now it's happening. Whatever I've set in motion, whatever I've transformed or performed, think of the words, they include form. I'm changing existing reality to be something I'd like it to be. When I realize things I can do, that's fulfilling, because that's a purpose we have, to be able to be functional, to be able to create, to be able to produce. It's very much aligned with our state of being. If we didn't breathe, we would not survive. If we didn't eat, drink water, all those things we know to do, we tend not to do with a lot of argument, but we fight over thoughts in our heads, thinking somehow we'll straighten them out and not notice the deteriorative effect it has on our bodies through anxiety, stress, depression, etc. It undermines all of our physical capacities. While we don't even understand all those capacities, we're capable of completely undermining each and every one of them in all their complexities or seeming complexity, physiological, anatomical, etc. So we talk about not knowing. We know more than we think. And largely we just think we don't know as an excuse to continue to perpetuate the mythology around the ideas we have that aren't true. And especially about the person we think we are, especially about the essence we are.
You know, Jack, it makes me wonder, I guess it's like that age-old philosophical question, going back to, like, let's say you murdered someone, but you never got arrested and it was an unsolved case. Like, are you a murderer in the same way of, like, you know, I know so many people in AA who are like, yeah, I haven't had a drink in 20 years. And then they're probably like snorting or smoking something on the side. So are they really sober? I don't know.
Well, I would stick with, you came in today with the struggle of your own, wondering if that 1% of your thinking that still thinks you might be able to, that you're wasting time in sobriety, is warranted, and in fact could eventually lead 20 years from now you saying, I've wasted all this time. And my sense is what you consider wasting time is simply not getting what you want.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it reminds me of that story in the Big Book of the guy who, like, for 30 years didn't have a drink, and then one day just put whiskey in the milk, you know?
Well, that's two stories, but they both made the point.
We were just talking about that.
Yeah. They both made the point. It's the insanity that somehow or another we're going to do something that we've done, but we're going to do it. We're going to tweak it a little bit. The one guy took however many years off and didn't drink until he retired, and then he started drinking and died within 2 years. The other guy used to own a car dealership, ended up losing the car dealership as a result of drinking, got sober, and he went out to what he thought was a place that he might find somebody interested in a car that happened to also have a bar in that place. He was just going to get a sandwich and thought, well, I could probably put some whiskey in my milk. That's something I've never tried. That would probably work. And then he said, yeah, you know what? That works so well. I think I'm going to do another one. And that is no different. See the thinking at the root of that? The thinking that thinking's going to solve the problem, and yet the thinking is so insane is to make believe that some minor change makes the thinking so new that it has no trace of any historic experience. That all of a sudden we make believe couldn't possibly have the consequence that we faced 1,000 times. It's not going to happen until it happens. And then we go into the disbelief of making believe, well, it's really not happening as bad as it used to happen. So I'm going to do more of it until I prove that it is, and then think that somehow or another alcohol's the problem, drugs are the problem. It's the thinking we're doing about it. The idea that we can control and enjoy it is the I would say, central idea that anyone who entertains those ideas is going to have an impulsive idea about wanting to drink or use reactive experiences when they feel overwhelmed, feel like they get into a fight, they're pissed off and resentful against somebody, to justify drinking, to fix it. Because they know that it makes them feel better. And what's ironic about drinking compared to most allergies, if you have a peanut allergy and you eat peanuts, you tend to, your throat swells up and you tend to suffocate. Most people don't need to eat a lot of peanuts before they stop eating peanuts when they have that effect. Alcohol has the strange effect of having us feel better, while it's actually not helping the problem get better, because if the thinking is staying the same and we need to feel better because of the thinking getting worse, all we're doing is drinking to deny the actual problem, which is in the thinking. And the thinking just keeps getting worse. So what do we need? More and more drinking. Overdoses are based on this attempt to try to stay ahead of this curve, like stay ahead of the pain. And it's a self-induced, self-imposed source of pain. If my thinking about my thinking is who I think I am, then any thought that doesn't go along with that threatens my life, in my estimation.
Well, I think it's also, something, I just was looking at quickly, was like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I mean, of course, the world, or at least societies we build, are imperfect, and there's a lot of suffering and injustice and inequality. But at least for the people here, I'm like a person in a first world country and blah, blah, blah. And like, I do want to take this opportunity of having the fucking opportunity to begin with to reach some self-actualization. Because I don't know, like for me, filmmaking, it's just a perfect state. It's where I feel any performance really, but it's like last night I was watching Blue Velvet by David Lynch in the theater, and I was just, for me, that was a very spiritual moment. And that's why I want to be actualized in that industry. But of course, it's like, not everything is in your control. You definitely realize that in sobriety.
But so Jimmy, all of those ideas are attached to an idea that you will be better when you do that, meaning you're not better now. And if you're not better now and you're not addressing the present state of your being, you're really learning to make believe that somehow or another you'll be better at a time that never comes, because whenever that time you get to, if it's a year from now or 10 years from now, it's always going to be the present when you're there. And if you have worked for years trying to think you should be somewhere else, when you get there, even if you got all those things you thought you wanted, you would still think, I need to be, this isn't it, it isn't enough, I need more. That's the addictive nature of this. We have been so quick to ignore the nature of our present existence. And it's the only thing that's ever happening. For everything that's happening, it's always only happening in the present. And to think because we don't think about what's happening, we're not in the present, is a huge leap. It's a claim that we have literally voided the whole nature of time and space simply because we're not thinking about what's happening. Think of how much credit we must give thinking, especially when we think it's who we are, to make believe that we're not in the present when we're not thinking about the present, rather than thinking, I'm actually in the present, thinking about something that isn't happening. If my time is largely spent in the present, thinking about things not happening, what are the chances things are going to go well for me? I don't have any connection to what's actually happening. Well, how am I going to influence any of that? How am I going to be productive? How am I going to be useful? I'm not interacting on the basis of anything other than a non-substantive thought, which is an illusion. Thought to be real, which is a delusion, which is insanity. That thing you got when you started getting sober, how long is it now, Jimmy? 2 years?
In October, it will be 3.
3? So that thing, that freedom that we each get is actually the chance to see what's wrong clearly so we can begin to face it, begin to have it, begin to reckon with it on a daily basis. That's the spiritual progress. The spiritual progress is beginning to see that we are The disease is progressive if we keep maintaining the ideas that are sick. And if we maintain those ideas that are sick, we're managing the ego, we're managing the problem, we're managing the disease rather than maintaining our spiritual condition. The dismantling of these ideas is the reckoning with the fact that we've always had an absolute state of knowing awareness. We've always been graceful in our capacity, and yet we've been dysfunctional in our human expression of that capacity. Simply because we're thinking about things that aren't true as being true. And that cavalcade of internal conflict that's created seems to consume so much of our attention because we're maintaining it rather than noticing it and saying, wow, I just started that. I'm going to maintain it by thinking I shouldn't be doing it, by thinking it shouldn't be happening, by thinking in any way other than simply saying, why am I starting this? Well, one answer is because I can. The other answer is because I'd like to tempt fate. It's exciting. But why would I keep maintaining it, thinking it would become right if I weren't insane to imagine that somehow I could turn something that's false, something that doesn't exist, into reality? Simple fact about this universe, Gabe, you can jump in here too, is that there is no more or less energy in this universe. Matter is a form of energy. There is no more or less reality in this universe in terms of the matter that we live in. Everything, we don't create reality when we make a car. We actually just transform elements that are already here. They already exist. We're just turning them into something else. We're making them into something else. So this idea that we can become the makers of reality by thinking of ourself, and all of a sudden we become the self. We become born of the thought. All of a sudden we're born of thought, not noticing that all that creates is more and more thought. That's obsessive thinking. I got to think about it all the time. I got to think about the thing I'm thinking about all the time so that I can think about it more to ensure that I'm alive, because my whole existence becomes based now on thinking. So I become compulsed and obsessed with thinking, and wondering why I don't feel so well, and feel depressed, and feel disconnected and alone and low self-esteem. How much esteem does myself have if it's illusion thought to be real? Has none at all, zero. But I can think it does, and I can think I need to fix it, and I can think what I really need to do is love myself more. And if the essence of the universe is love, which second tradition tells us it is, then I already got all the love I need. And yet, what am I doing? Making believe it's up to me, up to my thinking, to be the person that has enough love to love myself. What am I trying to love? I'm trying to love hate. I'm trying to love something born in fear. Why wouldn't self-centeredness be fearful? We're trying to make believe who we are is what we think, and we're not. Of course we're filled with fear because we're actually experiencing a sense of disconnection from reality and truth. Why wouldn't we be afraid? We're arguing in the name of non-existence, which is a suicidal tendency. Good morning, Maureen K. So, Jimmy, to that thought that you're wasting time, time's passing whether you spend it or not, right? Not up to you. Time happens within our human experience, within this universe. It's one of the components of it.
It's like that old story where the person says they don't know if they want to go to law school because it's 4 years will go by. It's like the 4 years go by no matter what.
I remember my mother saying that to somebody. They said, you know, if I go now, I'll be 45 when I'm done. And she said, how old will you be if you don't go? But the point is, we will think in ways that are so insane and so twisted and believe them because that self-centered thinking only looks inward. It doesn't look to the fact that our back is up against the wall of the limits of our thinking, constantly defending it, pretending because our back is there, it's not happening. We've turned our back to it, and all we're doing is looking at the center. All we're doing is looking back in the middle to try to figure out how to be there, how to stay there, how to keep our self there, how to keep ourselves centered. If there is no self other than thinking of itself, there is no center for it. It takes a constant effort to make believe that somehow we'll find balance doing that. And it destabilizes our whole experience because all of our thinking becomes destabilized, trying to come to terms with something that doesn't even exist, trying to think that we'll turn it into reality the more and more we think about it. And I would say that's the root of emotional sobriety, what Bill Wilson described as cutting away false dependencies. What greater false dependency could there be is to imagine that our thinking of itself creates who I am. And now I need to, rather than say, wait a minute, that isn't who I am. That's just a thought thinking about itself. What that's doing is creating more thinking. That's it. It's over. Rather than think what I need to do is fix that self. I need to get that self better. I need to have more confidence. I need to have more ambition. What I need is a new car. What I need is more friends. What I need is more people that think like I do and don't contest what I say so I can feel better and not be hurt by their thoughts, not have my feelings hurt. Why are my feelings hurt? Because I'm scared to death that anybody doesn't think like me, because my life depends on, in my own insane thinking, all that I'm thinking. And thus, everything everyone else is thinking.
Yeah, Jack, there's some theoretical physicists who believe the actual amount of total energy in the universe is zero.
Right.
You can't make something out of nothing.
Right.
The conservation of energy and mass, E equals MC, is you have to have something there to start with to make something.
Well, and what's interesting, I did a little research this week because I'm always curious about light, because it's just such a fascinating aspect of the universe and our experience. And especially when you think about enlightenment and radiance and brightness and brilliance, all those words that are used for this sort of enlightened state of being, I would say. But the thing I read said that there's radiation and energy in light, but it's effective mass, which it doesn't have any because it doesn't have any matter, it's actually just energy, is the momentum of its speed, because it's always doing full speed. It doesn't start at zero and end up at 186,000 miles a second. It's always doing full speed wherever it is, however it is, all the time. It's absolute in nature.
Mm-hmm.
And here we have a physical element, literally one of those that we live with on a daily basis, revealing the absolute nature of existence. And yet we can still be prone to argue with that and think, no, it can't be absolute now because I don't think it is. And these things aren't going my way and I'm not getting what I think I want. And all of those ideas I have would impair that ability to say, no, it's happening as it's happening right now, regardless of what I'm thinking. So what I'm really struggling with is not reality and truth, but my thoughts, and really begin to sort of put it into focus. That whole idea that we suffer from a lack of proportion that Bill said is thinking that nothing means everything and everything means nothing. So if I'm making believe what's false is true, I'm trying to make believe nothing is everything. And if at the same time, I have to believe that everything is nothing. And that would be a major conflict in functional capacity, functional literacy of actually just reading the signs and saying, wow, that tension I feel is an accurate assessment of something I'm doing that really scares me. Because I know that I'm doing something that not only it may appear to be my solution, but it's actually killing my experience. My body is wearing the weight of that anxiety and it's undermining every one of my metabolic and psychosympathetic and nervous system. Every one of my systems in my body are undermined by their ability to function is undermined by that stress I create. And we know that. We're aware of that. We feel it. We feel wrong. We feel bad. We feel disconnected. So if emotional sobriety, as Bill described it, is cutting away false dependencies, and the primary false dependency would be who I am is what I think, period. And that, rather than look at all the problems we're capable of creating and all the ones in our life and all the people and all the relationships and all the things we aim at, say, well, that would include everything. If the source of my thinking is incorrect and I'm insane enough to make believe all I am is what I think, if I just come to terms with that, all of a sudden the rest of it starts straightening out very quickly. And it becomes obvious that this has been a thinking problem, nothing more. And I have no obligation to continue. If I'm able to see it clearly, I'm clearly free enough to witness what I'm doing and not make believe that I become subject to it or an effect of it. or my thinking, my emotions attack me, my brain attacks my ego. None of those things are true. It's impossible for something that I have to all of a sudden have a life of its own and attack me unless I think it has a life of its own. And that's effectively what I do when I think my thinking is my self. Thinking about
what was your moment of clarity again, Jack? I forgot.
Today.
So thinking is as bad as a drink.
Well, it's the precursor. You know, Bill says that the physical allergy is coupled with this mental obsession. The allergy of the mental obsession is lying. Since a lie has no base, a lie only claims to be what it's not, which is true, right? So if something claims only to be what it isn't, what is it? It has no basis whatsoever. It's delusion to make believe. It's something we can think of. It's something we can act on. Doesn't mean that it has any basis and that it will ever have any basis. So to make believe that something that isn't true will someday be true is to make believe that it will be what it absolutely can't be. And to think life becomes impossible when we think impossible thoughts like that is to once again divest ourselves of the responsibility for the thinking we're doing, causing that impression.
Then, like being punch drunk, I'm thought drunk.
Exactly. Well, it's an intoxication.
Yeah.
Our own thinking. And it's the wheels go round. And what do? We know we're struggling with thoughts that are going around. So what do? Think about them more. And think about them more. And think about them more. And think about them more. Worry is a prayer for what we don't want. So what do? We
so
worry.
If the rum isn't working, switch to scotch. Just keep thinking. Just keep doing it. Keep going.
Yeah. Well, but that's addiction in a nutshell.
Yeah.
If the problem is drinking and what I do to prove I can control it is to drink uncontrollably, that is sort of an argument. I'm trying to claim that I'm better by doing more and saying, look at me, I can do this, and it's not really having any effect. But what I'm doing is learning as I get better at the drinking to deny the effects better and make believe that denial is in fact now my savior. Which again is exactly what I'm doing when I make believe who I am is what I think. I'm denying reality and truth in an essence that transcends my brain, transcends my body, and doesn't really even transcend it because it isn't beyond it. It's within it and without it. It's simultaneous in all respects because it can't be spatially bound if it's absolute and infinite and omnipotent as Bill described it.
So I can't think my way out of thinking.
Well,
just like I can't drink my way out of drinking.
No, you can't drink your way out of drinking either. But if the thinking we're doing is wrong, the undoing of it is starting to see it accurately, and it will immediately be obvious how insane it is to keep doing that thinking. Because the question will be, why do I keep doing this? Rather than take it so seriously as to think that we're being condemned by it, it becomes laughable to imagine that we've taken this persona so seriously as to make believe it's all we are, and then wonder why we feel our life depends on perpetuating, when in fact it's killing our life through anxiety and stress and depression. And I would say suicide rates today are at an all-time high as a result of this. It hasn't been looked at honestly. I don't think sobriety has been looked at honestly to be seen as a mental. Bill Wilson saw it that way. It was a mental problem, sourced in a mental problem, but I don't think in the mental health industry, through most cities and counties and municipalities in the country, is divided between drug addiction and alcoholism and mental health, thinking of it as two separate components rather than the same thing. So how do you treat something that's misdiagnosed incorrectly? What does that mean? It gets worse. What are we seeing? Things happening. Drugs now are being legalized. They don't know what to do with it, so they're legalizing it. What are people doing? Less drugs? No. More. I'm not suggesting they shouldn't. People are going to do what they want to do. They're free to. We each are. But I am suggesting if we talk about it honestly, it may provide a window into a discussion that could actually impress someone somewhere at some point in a direction of starting to look at what we're doing more honestly than continue to perpetuate these ideas that we're promoting about spending billions and billions of dollars to build condos for people to get them better. I have not known anyone in sobriety, and I've probably known 1,000 people to get sober that got a condo and it saved them, or a car, or a new pair of shoes. That volition that each of us have is critical to the decision we make to begin to look at things honestly and begin to act accordingly. For each of us, we're all free enough to have a free will to be able to fight as hard as we want. Nobody's ever going to stop us from that. And it's the beauty of responsibility with a capital R to begin to realize that we're each responsible, even when we're acting irresponsibly. We're still responsible for that irresponsible act. We don't divest our absolute responsibility. We just preoccupy ourselves with the frustration of the irresponsibility, and to not see it accurately is to continue to perpetuate it as though somehow we'll fix it, when in fact it's delusional to even imagine there's anything to fix. And I think that's a key component to this, because it's really it's the first step in relation to all that thinking. We admitted we were powerless because I thought I could continue to maintain the lie, and someday it would get better, and someday it would become true, and someday if I just thought about it more, I would straighten it out. It's the same thing I did with drinking. It was based on a lie. I can control it and enjoy it someday. I'll just keep doing more of it until I prove it. And what am I proving every time I do it? That I don't have control and I don't enjoy it. And I'm sick to my stomach, but all I'm doing is trying to feel better by doing more of it. And getting over things and feeling better about what we're doing is wrong is the exact same thing within recovery. It's the same form of thinking, and it's depressing. And it's alienating and gives us an impression of being alone because the thought has no basis. It can't even be connected to reality at all. Why wouldn't we feel alone?
Makes sense to me.
So the dance is, if we're having feelings are effects, right? They've got to have a cause. If we're having feelings, my experience is that I really don't always see my thinking, but I'm always aware of the effects. So I don't always know all that I'm thinking. I'm paying attention to kind of this loose conversation in my head that I may fixate on, but there's more going on than just that in my thinking, because I'm aware of thousands of things happening and I'm not paying a lot of attention to most of them. And yet I'm monitoring and adjusting and sort of aware in the distance. And I've got a sense of things that's much greater than the conversation I have in my head. And my experience is that most of what I thought was consciousness was that conversation, and everything else was something else, when in fact, that awareness is absolutely in place. So if I'm thinking about that as all that I know, I'm limiting the chance to sort of surrender to that greater sense of knowing and start to concede that, in fact, I know a lot more than I'm thinking, and start to actually witness that totality and notice that I'm really an observer. If I can watch my thoughts and I can feel those effects, I'm really the witness to those things. I'm really the observer of those things. And you don't have to go to India to come to this conclusion, though it could probably be helpful in certain respects. The point is, to begin to see it clearly is to begin to recognize that we've always been that observer, even while we thought we were the thoughts, and thought that we were in the thoughts, and thought that all we were was the thoughts. And we can still do that whenever I fight the effects, because I don't like the discomfort I'm experiencing. I'm always assigning the problem to something that I think is causing the effect other than me in my thinking. When I don't like something that's happening, it doesn't mean what's happening isn't happening. It means I don't like what's happening. And to think that my not liking it means that thing shouldn't be happening sets me on a course of being at odds with everything that's happening. Because once I'm contaminated, I don't see it as one thing. I see it as everything. Why? Because I lose a sense of proportion. I become engulfed in the flames of this intoxication that my thinking's going to straighten that stuff out. And the contemplative awareness, the awakening, is beginning to see that I'm always awake to what's wrong. I'm just not always willing to act on it affirmatively, productively, usefully. So I perpetuate it. In the name of thinking I'm solving it, I continue to maintain it. In the name of thinking it will end, the harder I do it, the more I maintain it. The worse I feel. What do I have to do? Get better at feeling better about it. I'm in a sober cycle of this same mentality, trying to feel better about what I'm doing that's wrong by doing other things to feel better, including service. And I would say if I'm serving other people in the name of trying to avoid what I'm doing that's wrong, I'm not carrying the message. I'm carrying the hope that I can feel better rather than someone else actually get better. And I would say that's probably one of the reasons that AA right now, in terms of numbers, is sort of topped out. It doesn't seem to be growing at least at the number level that people keep track of. And it's interesting that we have a problem on our streets and throughout our country, in the world of addiction, that is completely out of control, no different than any of us were as individuals. And this conversation we have, I would suspect, would be much more useful if it looked at this more inclusively rather than exclusive to our own experience and what we each do to sort of get by every day, and start to see that we actually share a bounty and of abundance and absolute nature that isn't divisible, it isn't separate, it isn't distinguishable, it isn't discriminatory. Yeah.
I actually, I'm obviously not one for pessimism or blah, 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 but I see a disturbing trend in general where, like, the education system, maybe outside of private schools in our country, is like they're almost purposefully dumbing down students, where like students at public or charter schools, like, are not being tested for SATs or ACTs, or, they're saying like they're conflating like math with like racism, or just like adding in these like political ideas behind academic subjects, and it's all in the name of equality. And
so let's look at it from our point of view here, Jimmy. What would that suggest to you? Like, as a human, as a being, it's
like they're trying to address
not them, you. What does this mean?
Oh, to me, what it addresses, I guess what it basically means to me is like, I get selfish about it, where I'm like, well, I'm smarter than them, so on a primitive level, I have one over them. But then at the same time, I just am like, wow, so I guess I have to become successful because they're starving society at a certain point. And, it's ever more abundant in terms of like, I have to be sober. Because now if I fall, I'm going to fall, I think, harder.
Well, listen, you don't have to be anything, but you can be. And the freedom always allows you not to do anything.
Because it's like, do you read these articles about like the youth, in their boredom or maybe in their lack of proper parenting, they're just attacking people all the time. And it's always in urban places.
But Jimmy, think about your own experience. When do you attack people? When do you react to people? When do you find yourself doing those things?
I never jumped anyone, though.
Well,
I always fought fairly.
I never did heroin, so I guess I'm not a drug addict.
Well, you're not a heroin addict.
But keep in mind what I'm saying. To try to discount the question is to try to avoid the answer. Where do you react? Where do you do those things? What is it? What are the conditions that occur when you're doing those things? And it's not, you don't have to give me an answer, but I can help you through the answer if you'd like.
Well, I also don't think that you can really do anything to protect yourself from random acts of violence. Or
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about Jimmy making decisions to be reactive.
Oh, I don't. I just keep moving.
You don't react.
Not these days. These days, I'm literally constantly moving, which I think is the best way to stay out of trouble.
Well, but I would say that may be a reaction. That may be just a trained response to try to avoid the idea that if you stay still, you're going to get in trouble.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So maybe that's a reaction. And the point I'm making is that any ideas that I maintain that aren't true, I'm reactive about. There's a level of reactivity in me that's assigned to each and every one of those things. And I probably have so many of them going on, I think it couldn't possibly have anything to do with me, because it can seem so compelling to make believe that my job is to figure out what everyone else is doing wrong in the world rather than track it back and say, okay, what am I doing in relation to what everybody else is doing? And that's where the real problem begins. And that's where the solution ends or begins also.
Yeah, but as a sober person, you do realize that you're a member of the community and you have responsibilities to the community. And like, we can go on and on about the individualist nature of sobriety, but it's founded on a fellowship. It's founded on helping people. It's all around, I guess. I think Bill and Bob's ultimate goal was to make us like beneficial to society. And
usefully, I guess, are the words.
I was more speaking to your point of like what seems to be the epidemic of almost legalized degeneracy taking place at a moment where
I'm focusing again. Sober. We've all witnessed this. We've all been party to this. And it's basically the attempt to make believe that we can get better by being and acting irresponsible. Right now, if a kid goes to school and he's told he doesn't have to take a test because they're afraid he won't pass it, and really what that means is they can't get the money they need to run the class if they don't pass the tests that are required to have that accomplished, he's being asked not to learn. He's at school being asked not to learn. It doesn't seem to add up to me. Doesn't seem like that's responsibility. It's like people on the streets. The worse they get, the closer they get to getting a free condo. What does that mean? That if they do less, if they act worse, they have a better chance of being taken care of.
I don't know, man. I don't want to get so much into conspiracies, but
I'm not talking about conspiracies. I'm talking.
I know.
Listen to the point. If the idea of addiction is that we can do the wrong thing and get better, and that we're going to be saved by being irresponsible, that's exactly what's happening in that broader way. Within the mindset of people well beyond what you might call addicts, but are functioning on the exact same basis, thinking that what we need to do is spend billions of dollars to give people condos and apartments, and that's going to solve the problem. That is not, if cancer research was suspended until they built another 10,000 hospital beds, and everybody was told they could sleep in the parking lot until then, that would be completely insane and ridiculous. And anyone who would even propose that would be considered to be violating any kind of license or oath they have to help people get better. And yet we're doing it in a broad way with thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people. And it's the same thinking. It's the same obsessive, I've got the answer. Now, because it's going to take 7 or 8 years, anybody can claim today it's the solution, because the proof it isn't the solution will take 7 or 8 years before people say, oh. And actually, the state legislature in California asked recently, said, we've spent billions of dollars. The things are getting worse. What's wrong? It's a very good question. If our ability and our capacity between us is hamstrung by having conversations about what's wrong with everybody else and not focused on what we're doing that's wrong individually, collectively, we do not become a voice that's going to make anything better, but everything worse. Coming to terms with this addiction, this source, this mental addiction, this mental illness, is a chance to begin speaking openly and honestly, regardless of how people respond and regardless of exactly the way Bill described the message can be carried. If somebody doesn't want to listen, move on. He didn't say take it personally, get offended, be reactive, hate them, spite them, tell them what's wrong with them, what they should do. He just says move on. There's other people. Maybe there'd be some help going on if they were actually looking for people rather than considering everybody needs a condo, starting to actually look for the people interested in help and getting them that help so they can become productive again and actually become useful and actually participate in society, which is the way we're designed. There may be some people that will never get to that level that society has an obligation to take care of in some way, but it is not taking care of anyone to watch overdose rates increase at the rate that they are and suicide rates increase at the rate that they are and not talk about it openly and honestly as a problem that is recognizable, definable, and discussable.
I don't know. I personally see, there was that Napoleon quote where he said, religion is basically the only thing that keeps the poor from killing the rich. And now that the general trend toward atheism in the West has reached kind of like a peak, I just notice coincidentally this happens at the same time as like proliferation and legalization of drugs. And, now it's like, it's so much easier to make porn and become rich from that, like with OnlyFans and stuff. And
So re-aiming back, what are we each doing that's helping that continue? We are part of it. We are not apart from it. Those people are not out there. Right now, they are here as we're talking about them. And they are here connected to us wherever we are all the time. And to any degree we're thinking about it as different, we're actually creating the divisions that are allowing that to continue as though it's something distinct from us rather than being caused by us. And this isn't to say go out and take everything on and become the voice. It's simply to notice that we have an impact on everything based on what we think. And when we're not thinking healthy thoughts, the impact we have is not helping. It's actually helping people get worse and helping ourselves to the idea that we're a big help. And when you talk about the direction of sobriety being service, it also says trust God, clean house, then serve others. It's a very prescribed order.
well, God has also overseen the downfall of empires. And I personally think we are currently living through
I doubt it. Do you think God ever saw the building of those empires? Those are all human endeavors.
God is everywhere.
But it doesn't mean God sees delusion and illusion. It doesn't mean God sees endeavor that makes believe that they're true and real because they're creating this empire. Those aren't empires. They're the same molecular structure as Gabe described earlier. The essence of it doesn't change. And that would, if God is essence, then God's not looking at the details. God's not trying to get involved in the coming and going that we do and the thinking that we do and the impact that we have, because we have already got everything that God has to give. And what we're doing with it is not very aligned with that nature. It's very aligned with our own preoccupation of what we call human nature.
I'm just talking about societal empires. I mean,
I get it.
The downfall of the West.
I'm talking about the fact that if it's falling down, it never stood. It was
organism is
pompous, arrogant process of making believe that people could be held oppressed, suppressed, and in opposition to reality and truth. The reality and truth has never changed during that whole time. So it's beginning to take the structure of what we see as being real and true and realizing it was never real and true. It was just an expression of thought. It was just an expression of ideas. It was just an expression. Many of those empires were driven by guys who were narcissists, dictators, not malevolent to their people, but abusive to their people in the name of thinking their ideas were right for everybody. So anyone who didn't agree with them was killed. Or in some way,
well, I don't know. To me, it goes back to this idea of like, as long as I'm sober, the whole earth can burn and go to hell. But as long as I'm sober, everything is fine and dandy.
Well, sobriety is not limited to simply recovering from a drug or an alcohol or anything, gambling, sex, food, whatever the compulsion is. Sobriety, and it's actually, that would be a dry drunk, would be somebody who hasn't been drinking or isn't using drugs simply because they can abstain for a period of time. That is not sobriety. Sobriety is about sanity. It's about sane living. Emotional sobriety is about sane living. Recovery from any of those drugs is about sanity, which is why the second step says we're restored to sanity. Why? Because in the first step, we were still debating as to whether or not we had power. Why were we insane? We knew we didn't have any power, and we kept thinking we did. As long as we thought we did, we tried to prove it. What did we prove? We had no power. What did we say? Look at me. I can do this. The more I do, the more I prove. The worse I get, the more I prove I'm in control. All I need to do is deny the worst that's happening and pretend it's not happening to me, and it's as a result of everything and everyone else. It's that same thinking. So if we're doing it, Jimmy, you and I are talking about it, the bonus and benefit we each have is that we share what's actually going on between us so that we have a chance to begin to see what we're doing and then start to look out into the world. And the difference is, rather than seeing everything as something despicable, it becomes something that actually has the same possibility that you and I have to be able to be seen accurately and corrected.
I mean, it depends on location too. Like, obviously, if you're living in a mansion in sunny California, I doubt you'll have the same perspective as someone in like Chicago, That's why, to me, it's like there's the Wizard of Oz and then there's Taxi Driver, different perspectives.
Yeah. But perspective doesn't change the absolute nature. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about beginning to see that all of these variations we create to distract ourselves don't distract from an absolute nature. And if we can begin to reinforce within our thinking that the absolute nature doesn't change when our thinking changes, you begin to see how far humans go to make believe, if they think differently and think more of this and less of that and more of that and less of this, that somehow it's going to change everything and correct everything. And it just keeps looping and looping and looping on that same basic thinking, rather than say, oh, the absolute nature of everything is already absolute. It's already something we all share. And if you and I talk about it that way, and us talk about it that way here, which is the point of this, the absolute knowing nature of intuition will start to allow us to function on a basis where what we do actually matters, because it's actually connected to something that everyone shares, rather than simply what we're thinking individually. And I would say that's an awakening. And that's those moments of clarity people get when they finally listen and hear something. And it actually doesn't penetrate. It just is, they're aware that they know what they're hearing, and start to actually take a little step back from the tendency of making believe they have to rethink it, to own it and have it as their own experience and their own knowledge, and start to see, oh, I've known all along that I've known all along. That's a very different experience than trying to sort all this stuff out by thinking more and more and more in some new divisive, separate way. Hasn't worked yet. It's not going to work.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard people say that, like, the point of existence is just to have good food, good sex, blah, blah, blah. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I'm the only one.
If the source of an absolute state of being is love, which, the second tradition tells us the only authority is a loving source, loving God. If that is the source, then that would be the purpose, to love. And what would love mean? Certainly not spite, hate, division, antagonism, any of those things. It would be supportive, generous, giving, but not in a fake, insincere, lacking genuine both resolve and honesty. It's starting to see that talking honestly very often creates reactivity in other people and helps trigger them. There's nothing wrong with that. It gives people a chance to see what they're doing and how they're functioning. They may not like it. They may accuse you of all sorts of things, but your job is not to have that respond for them. Your job is to speak honestly, and as honestly as you possibly can.
Well, I'm just going to keep going, doing what I'm doing, because I don't really see an alternative anyway.
You've done a good job, and I applaud that. And I would say continuing on a daily basis, like today and here and now, is the way you begin to build the awareness, the thinking awareness, that when you feel teetering, you feel struggle, you feel the things that might normally tip you in a direction of doing the wrong thing, you know that there are other options. And that doesn't just go for drinking and using. It goes for all the kind of thinking that gets you into those corners that you feel stuck in and feel are impossible.
Well, that's another thing too, man. Like, you know, I don't know if this is true for anyone else, but like, the longer you stay clean, it's harder for me to go to meetings because it's such a bombardment of just negativity and psychosis. And of course, I used to be that person saying crazy shit.
If you're reacting to it now as something that's difficult, you are still thinking those thoughts. So just use that as an opportunity to notice, wow, I wouldn't be reacting to this stuff if I wasn't reactive. And that gives you a chance, Jimmy, to be honest in ways that may not seem, because you're not doing it as bad as you used to think that you're not doing it would be to do the same thing that used to keep you redoing it.
Well, there is that saying, a meeting is a meeting, right?
Yeah. And listen, the difference is rather than see it as something that you don't like, start to say that, wow, this is actually a good chance to start. Everybody's actually giving me an opportunity to see the connection I have to that stuff because I don't like it. I feel very reactive to it. I feel very triggered by it. Wow, they're all giving me an opportunity now. I don't see them as wrong. I see them as actually an asset, a gift. And that gives you a chance to actually be compassionate for what they're doing because you're actually seeing it as something you're doing. That's the message. That's the carrying of it. That's the seeing that it's already in their lap in the same way it's in your lap. You share it already. When you speak from those terms, people have a much better chance of actually hearing those things than talking about them as though there's something distinct from you and you're not doing that. And you're, like you said earlier, better than them. All those ideas.
You know, I don't want to go that far because I just think I'm lucky, to be honest. Many times over, I think that is the pivotal point for so many addicts, is that they were lucky enough to escape or survive. And in that, I don't know, in that luck, in that somewhat, you know, that element of clarity where you are glimpsing upon your whatever environment with, you know, a new pair of glasses, as the program talks about. You are just seeing things, you know what I mean? And I don't know, I see an infrastructure that appears as if it's on the cusp of crumbling. It just makes me a little fearful because, like, at a certain point, you know, when do people start looking at you as a leader instead of another?
Well, why don't you start leading and honestly beginning to look at stuff and start to recognize that that's the only choice you have is to be honest or dishonest. Whether it's good or bad for people is up to people. They're going to decide what they want. And keep in mind, I don't think it's luck. If the possibility that people get sober is possible, it isn't luck when people get sober. It's a reckoning, an honest reckoning that somehow seems to come with this thing called grace. But it also seems to come when people start actually looking at what they're doing honestly and start listening in ways that they never, like considering that you may be an alcoholic or a drug addict. Just that consideration alone starts to open the window to other thoughts that you would not listen to at all if you said, I'm not an alcoholic and drug addict. I'm not any of those things.
The vast majority of people in 12-step programs do not achieve any type of sobriety. And those who achieve long-term sobriety, the percentages are even lower.
Have you met the vast majority of people in sobriety?
No.
Okay, so the talk here, looking at what we're doing, you and I, is critical to the decisions we make that can affect all those other people that you think for some reason don't have sobriety. For any reason you might think that. can affect them in a way that give them that thing you think they don't have, simply by doing the thing you don't think they're doing.
You were speaking before about how AA has seemed to, plateau a bit and membership is stagnating. And I think it's also because of the idea that people are realizing that it's a heavily flawed program. Because it's run by the inmates. It's not run by any kind of real administration.
There's nothing flawed about the program. It's the application that's flawed. And that's what I'm talking about right here, right now, between us. If we're so fixated on what everybody else is doing in society and crumbling empires and all that kind of stuff, imagine how we have such expertise to be able to figure everything else out, and so little practice at simply conceding what we can do right now, honestly, what we can discuss in absolute terms that we both share and all of us share, to start to actually see that thing out there for what it actually is rather than what we've made believe it was. Those crumbling empires are no different than the crumbling of the persona that I think is who I am when I think my thoughts are who I am. And that personality that I've developed, filled with characteristics that are defective by their nature because they're just things I did because I thought they were the best thing to make me look good, so that I could appear good, so that I could think that everybody thought I was good, because I know that I'm bad when it comes to thinking who I am is all that I am is what I think. If all I am is all everything is and sourced in something that's absolute, then to think all I am is what I think is a pretty small drop of dust in the totality of things. And why wouldn't I feel less than and alone? So in thinking in those terms, to get so grandiose is to make believe I have a great idea about what's wrong with everybody else. And listen, it doesn't keep me from talking about the things I think. But if the insanity of addiction is insane and people are thinking the same insane way, the policies are going to be based on failure rather than success. I don't say that because I'm looking at individual policies and trying to micromanage them, but because I know that line of thinking only fails in the name of success. It's designed to fail in the name of thinking more failure and more will and more virtue and more faith and more hope and more trust is worthy of constantly trying to work, when in fact there's none of those things that'll ever be enough to turn what isn't true into truth. Truth and reality already exist. They do not need our help.
What happens when the numbers keep dwindling?
Well, my sense is part of it is because sobriety has become going to meetings very often. My experience. Program doesn't say that. The book doesn't say that. The program are the steps, and not only the steps, the programs are the principles of the steps. Doesn't say.
I think I'm making a more cinematic point of like, what happens when there's more and more legalization and more proliferation, and there is not enough people in the meetings to have meetings anymore.
You're surmising things that aren't happening, and if there's no meetings,
not
there's
now.
no meetings.
10 years ago, who thought marijuana would be legalized?
There is nothing but now. There is no time but the present. The only place we ever are to actually talk about anything legitimately, honestly, is in the present. And if we're not doing that because we're sidewinding and all these other directions, it's just an indication of how quick we are to run everywhere else while we're actually still here, just thinking about all kinds of other eventualities and potentialities that aren't happening. That's addiction.
We belong to a program which was born out of hundreds of years of temperance movements. So there was a building through time to eventually reach that point. Now I just personally feel that the trajectory we're on is a demonic one. Like the culture seems like it's more nihilistic just more.
Before we go off into another one of these directions about your feelings and your thoughts, look at your own. For you to be thinking those things is for you to be doing those things. Start to settle into that and start to notice that all those big ideas you have about that out there is coming from you. Your eyes are not seeing that way because you have no influence on what you're thinking. And as you do, it isn't to say you can't have opinions. I have all sorts of opinions, and a lot of them are not right, which is why they're opinions. And I talk about them openly, and I don't have to be right to talk about things openly. But I'm pointing out that the essence of this conversation is to start to notice that we have an absolute essence that everything shares, everything everywhere, already has it, already is it, and how it looks and how it appears and all that other shaky stuff that we can see has no basis, which is why it's shaky. Things don't fall apart. Entropy is natural for everything in the universe. It eventually all falls back apart to its essence. It can't break down further than the essence. Everything's designed to do that.
Yeah, of course.
So all it means is that it gets built up and it fails. And what are we doing? It's like grandiosity. We make things up and say, look at me, look at us, look at what we've done. And yet
So
does that mean ignore, consider, Jimmy, just for 1 second. If we're trying to make things up that are impressive, aren't we thinking that everything that already exists isn't impressive? That it can't possibly be everything and that we can't possibly have anything to do with it for us to think that it's up to us to go out and make something of ourselves and make something of everything else, to make believe it's enough to say, look at me now, look what I've done. Here I am. Now I'm finally achieved, rather than seeing we all have that right now. Right now. It's the essence of essence. Cannot be optional, cannot be negotiated, cannot be here and not there. It's always where we are as humans, always. And it's full, it's complete. And to speak in those terms is to start to actually relax a little bit and start noticing the weakness in our own world, that we're in this immediacy of our own surroundings, and start to see the things we can maybe do that are better. So we become a better conduit for that knowing nature, rather than a better opinion maker that basically creates new opinions that helps everybody else develop their opinions and has us just slog through another couple thousand years to figure out how bad we needed to get before we actually start noticing what's happening. It's happening right now, and it's always happening right now, and it's always available in its entirety. And what we do to think in other terms.
It is the most unique point in history. The internet has allowed every human being on the planet to connect.
Everything is always connected. Well before the internet. The internet is a metaphor of humans trying to take credit for the interconnectedness of everything that's always been interconnected. It's always been interconnected. Always. As long as time has existed, it has been an interconnection of all things. We think in narrow terms because we think all we are is what we think. And to see in absolute terms is to start to see in inclusive terms that are as big as you could possibly even imagine. And that is not grandiosity. It's grandiosity to think that greatness is not great, and that greatness is not here, and that totality is not who we are and what we have. That's arrogance. That's grandiosity. That's pride. It is not pride if things are infinite to begin to actually acknowledge the infinite is infinite. So that's our discussion, to the degree that we're willing to have it. And we're not always willing to have this discussion to the point that it's designed to discuss. It's lots of meandering, lots of ideas, lots of thoughts, lots of opinions, lots of conclusions, lots of other directions, lots of things out there, lots of them, lots of there, lots of then. And yet, here we are, in our entirety, absolutely intimately connected to everything that's happening right now. And we make choices about what to do about that. And Obsessive thinking is the choice to try to think about things that we can't have any control over, and largely because we're thinking about them inaccurately. So there is no control over something that has no basis. There is nothing to control, which is what unmanageability ultimately is about. There's nothing to manage in insanity. Nothing to manage in a lie. There's nothing to manage in trying to have faith in faithless things, or trust in untrustworthy things, or hope in hopeless things. Nothing. All we do by perpetuating it is to give ourselves the impression that we're in control of it. And what are we in control of but insanity? Why would we want that if we were sane? Why would we even think in those terms if the basis of our thinking was correct enough, right enough, solid enough, rather than revealing that we've got a little bit of work to do, perhaps, as a species, just like Orville and Wilbur did when they decided they were going to fly. Didn't happen overnight. They had to whittle and work to get to the point that they finally figured it out and have it happen. And that's our choice. Are we going to mire ourselves in the age-old argument over what's not happening, or start to actually acknowledge what is happening?
But it is happening.
Of course,
That's
it's
my
happening.
point.
Of course, it no.
You know,
your point is
it's a beginning.
that what's happening is your opinion.
I don't think it's an opinion. I think it's
no,
the
you
start.
don't. That's why I'm pointing it out.
No, but if it's an opinion, if it's not supported by a fact, right?
What greater fact could there be that everything in an absolute source is absolute right now? Let's start there.
That is factual, but
Yeah.
there's
Followed
also
immediately
patterns
by a
that
but.
allow you. There's patterns that allow you to infer and make probable claims of what will happen.
Yes.
And it's, you know, it's like we've been on this rodeo before. And I just see it as like, okay, so I'm sober now. So do I have to try and build something to get in my little corner of the world? So when the shit hits the fan and I'm still alive, I have a place to stay, you know? That's what I see happening in a way. I see everyone preparing not just for their death, but for some looming apocalypse, you know?
Yeah. Well, I would say your thinking is apocalyptic. I share that at times. I think of those thoughts at times. It seems that way to me at times. I know that that's not truth. I know that what I'm entertaining are the limits of my own thoughts as truth and reality. And that is a very apocalyptic approach to thinking and living and experiencing my human experience. Self-fulfilling prophecies are based on that. And humans have been great at fulfilling their prophecy. We claim we're in control. So what do? Create the worst case scenario to prove, yeah, see, I said, look at, I knew it. I knew this was going to happen. It's very convenient. We're manifestors. We don't want to take credit for the things that we don't like. But the fact is, all that's happening right now, we have manifested. If it has anything to do with if we're involved in it at all, we're involved in all of it. So start there, if you want to start, as being the manifester of all the messes you see, to the degree that you think in terms that aren't true and aren't real and aren't absolute in concept. Because a lot of that stuff just dissipates when you begin to realize that there's a greater knowing source that has never changed and is not susceptible to all those doomsday prophecies and all that shortcoming that humans tend to like to create to prove that they're right. There's no risk at all in it. It's not a...
Well, Jack, I mean, if we're being historical too, right? It's like, isn't this the closest to World War III since the Cuban Missile Crisis?
It's really hard to say.
Let's just say Russia steps foot on 1 inch of soil of NATO territory. That's it. That is the end of the human race. And then bacteria will probably have to start.
It won't be the end of the
evolution.
universe. It will not be the end of the universe. The universe will go on just like it's going on right now with a few things out of sorts.
I don't think it'll be the end of the human race.
Yeah. I mean, I'm taking it to the extreme because the universe is barely affected by it's always doing what it's doing. That's all it does. It doesn't have an opinion. It doesn't have a preference. It simply does what it does without interruption, always. And the impact that we have on it doesn't destroy the universe. It just destroys our experience. Or at least our ability to reckon with the experience and realize the experience we're having is the one we're creating.
It'll destroy our experience of mandating and regulating truth and reality.
Yeah, thinking that it's up to us.
Yeah.
So see, there's no abundance in that thinking. So the outcome of that thinking, Jimmy, is always going to be a lack of abundance. And that's going to be scarcity. And that's going to be doom. And that's going to be, there's never enough. I need to carve something out just for me. So when it all goes to shit, I'll be okay. Think about that on a daily basis. Here we're in an abundant universe where everything that is possible in any given moment, all the time. And everything that's here is here right now. And we're thinking about it in the narrowest, tiniest ways and wondering why we're afraid and feel that there's no hope and feel that we're so sure about what everybody else is doing. I don't even know everybody yet. In terms of persona, in terms of face, in terms of name, in terms of place. And yet I have those same opinions about everybody else and everything going on. They're not true. They're just a chance for me to escape the unwillingness I have to reckon with what I'm doing in a way that has me sit in the seat I'm in and say, wow, I go to great lengths to try to imagine things for everybody else, while I don't go so far as to do that in my own experience. And the whole point of willingness this week is to see how willing we are to do that other thing and how unwilling we are to simply sit still and say, wow, I'm at the center of this. My experience is being created by what I'm thinking and what I'm choosing and how I'm seeing things. And my functional capacity as a human is being regulated by the disqualification and the dysfunctional thinking I'm doing. I'm disqualifying my functional capacity by thinking about things that aren't happening as though they're really all that's happening, and all of a sudden wonder why I feel so alone and separate. And have good reason for fear, because at that point I realize the greatest enemy I have is the one I think I am. Nothing more. Because I'm literally aware I'm doing this thing and can't even come to terms with the fact that it's me. I've got no perspective at all. I've lost perspective because I'm trying to make one single point. It has nothing to do with me. So what's the point I keep reinforcing? It's all happening to me. It isn't sane. It isn't healthy. It isn't natural. It isn't functional. So to speak in sane terms is to start to actually address this in the totality of it all, rather than in the attempt to put the bits and pieces together. They're not apart. Even while they look like they're falling apart and all that stuff, they're basically still what they've always been in their essence, regardless of how they've appeared. Things aren't how they seem, they're how they are. Things aren't how they appear, they're how they are. What we make of them isn't how they are, it's what we think of them.
I don't know, man. I mean,
yeah, you do.
This is like you can think whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
Putin said
Exactly.
This was a special military operation. It's supposed to have been 3 days. It's a year later. They already almost had a WW3 scare because they landed a missile in Poland by accident. Like, I'm just saying, I mean, yeah, of course it's intellectual masturbation, but like, if just anything happens, that's like, what the fuck is going to happen after that? And then,
but you know what
does this all even mean? You know what I mean?
Jimmy?
Mutually assured destruction. What does
you know what you can be sure of? And absolute certainly.
Dinner tonight?
No, that what's going to happen will happen. Period. And
Yeah,
I can assure you, I can assure you, no, it's not terrible. What you're terrified about is your own inability to look at what you're doing and make believe that somehow it's everyone else's doing, because you have immobilized yourself. You have disenfranchised yourself. You've disengaged yourself from having anything to do with it, and now are subject only to the effects everybody else is doing that you think is crazy, while you're missing the crazy you are actually perpetuating.
The craziest people are the ones who run the system, not the people in the system.
Well, you're doing it right now. You're speaking for the whole system. You are the voice for the system right this minute.
I think I'm a voice of clarity, to be honest.
Well, I'm sure you do. And
Like-
to some degree, you may be right on the button. But I will tell you, if it's causing the effects you're experiencing, they're being caused by the thinking you're doing, because nobody is closer to you. Nobody's closer to your pain and pleasure centers than your thinking. Nobody will ever be closer. Nobody will ever have the impact you have on your own experience, ever.
This is true.
If you weren't conscious of it, you wouldn't be affected by it. And the fact that we create our own, what we call consciousness, isn't really our consciousness. It's the collection of the thinking we're doing about the thing we're thinking about. That isn't our full consciousness. That is not our full awareness. That's just a limited version of our thinking about our thinking. And I know whenever I'm thinking obsessively and I have those phobic fears, that's what I'm doing. I don't have to figure out where. I don't have to figure out how. I don't have to figure out why. I don't have to figure out what. I just know that's what I'm doing, that I'm managing thoughts that aren't true. I'm maintaining ideas that have no basis. I had a
funny experience where a friend was telling me that she was so upset at her other friend for always seeking attention and being controlling. And I said, well, I hate to tell you this, but if you spot that, you probably have it. And I thought she'd get mad at me. She said, but yeah, well, I went to therapy for it, though. I don't have that problem anymore. So I thought I'm probably right then, because she did have a problem with that at some point.
Look, if we don't do something as much as we used to do it, it doesn't mean we're not still doing it. So if we're not as crazy as we used to be, it doesn't mean we're not still crazy in some way. And I'm not trying to condemn everybody to being crazy, but I'm suggesting that the whole idea is so anathema. It's so hard to stomach. The idea that we could be unhealthy mentally. It's not talked about openly enough, and yet it's acted on in ways that are unhealthy every day for everyone, to any degree that we maintain ideas, especially cultural ideas that aren't true, as though they're true. We're all suffering from it to that degree or more. It can be subtle, but to dismiss it as being nothing because it's subtle is to overlook the thing that will then grow into being significant enough not to be able to be overlooked. It's okay to have ideas that aren't true and make believe they're true. To think that you're going to turn them into truth by thinking about them more creates anxiety and depression and reactiveness and impulsiveness and compulsiveness. It's a choice we make to do that. It isn't something happening to us. It is being caused by us. We are the makers of our experience, nothing else, not reality and truth. Reality and truth are real and true and have been that way since the beginning. And they're not in a state of flux over circumstances like we get and consequences. They're an ever-present state of absolute knowing and peace, and whatever that stillness is that allows noise to even be recognizable, or articulation of things that are seen. That backdrop, that void. Something very different than we talk about and think about. And yet it's the nature of our knowing. It's an absolute state of being that we know. So talking about it and beginning to contemplate that will quickly eliminate the obsessive thoughts that you're having, trying to get to that thing, trying to perfect them. Because the simple contemplation of it, it becomes obvious that there's something there. As I begin to quietly notice in my own experience that the conflicts I'm having all are simply thoughts I'm maintaining that aren't true, and I'm thinking they're true, I'm believing in them, I start to see that these are just little crumbs that when I look at closely seem to be all that's happening, when in fact the absolute state of awareness that I'm looking from is massive in relation to it. There is no end to it. There is no beginning of it. It's something that is a state that's completely incalculable by rational, reasonable, logical thinking. And yet, we can be reasonable enough and logical to admit that it isn't something we're going to conclude. Why? Not because it can't be concluded, but because it's already in its totality where we are, how we are, as we are now. Period. To miss that is to miss our nature. And yet, our nature continues to continue. Sounds like a good note to end on or begin. Appreciate you guys all coming today, guys and gals.
Thanks, Jack.
And we'll continue. Keep in mind this thing about willingness. We always had a lot of willingness to fight. We always had a lot of willingness to do the right thing. I still have a lot of willingness to fight and do the wrong thing. Principles can be liabilities. The difference is when I try to apply a principle to something that's untrue and has no basis, I can apply and apply and apply and apply and apply, just like drinking and using drugs or any other compulsion. I become compulsive about thinking I'm going to be willing and faithful and hopeful and persevere long enough, but I'm trying to do something that can't be done. And on the other side, if I begin to actually function on a basis of beginning to notice that I'm willing to let things be as they are, in an instant, I'm confirmed that things are as they are. And I begin relating to them in ways that I don't have to continue to be willing, because I start seeing they're already willing on my behalf. That's what a principle is. It's something that exists regardless of what I think. It's something that underlies everything in the most functional way, because it's the basis of function in terms of our human experience. It's not a choice. The difference is when I choose to think about it incorrectly, I choose to oppose it actively and think I'm going to overcome that fight. And I can't, because I'm both the creator of the fight and I'm at the effect of the fight. And when I'm the creator of the fight and don't want to be it, I think I'm only the effect. And when I'm only the effect trying to stop the thing, I have no sense of cause, so I can't stop. I keep restarting it thinking I'm going to stop it. And that's the nature of addiction, especially mental. It's constantly redoing the same thing, thinking I'm going to end it by doing it more and more and more, rather than see it's not about stopping it. It's about noticing that we keep starting it. That's where my willingness is. My willingness is to keep starting it over and over and over and over and over again, and wonder why I can't stop it. It makes perfect sense why I can't stop it when I start seeing it in its totality, because I begin to see that I'm the one continuing to restart it, thinking it's the only thing I can do, the only thing I should do, the only thing I have to do, the only option I have. Those are all addictive thoughts. When I'm willing to let things be as they are, that's honesty. That's courage. That's integrity. Why is it courage? There's no more discouragement. Integrity is integration of all things, not the separation of all things. Humility is having things as they are, not as I think they are, letting them be. What are they? What they are, not what I think. There's a whole shift. There's freedom in that, rather than condemnation, rather than contempt, rather than spite, rather than fight, rather than indignation, etc. Glad to be with you all times.
Thanks, Jack.
Thank you all.
Bye, Jack. Love you.
Love you too,
Happy
Jenna.
Sunday.
Thanks.
Bye,
Thanks.
guys.
Bye, guys.